In 1932, a Detroit housewife named Clara fed her family of 7 on $4 a week. Her secret was a single jar of bacon grease that touched every meal she cooked for 11 straight years. Today, the FDA would tell you that jar was a health hazard. But here is the strange part. Number 14 on this list was so effective that the government actively discouraged it during the war years because it threatened the rationing program. And number 3, scientists are now studying it for properties that modern preservatives cannot match. These 25 food hacks kept 25 million Americans alive through the worst economic collapse in our nation's history. Then we forgot them on purpose, because if you knew what your great-grandmother knew, half the products in your grocery cart would suddenly look ridiculous. Hit that subscribe button. What you are about to learn might change the way you cook for the rest of your life. Let us count down. Number 25. The bacon grease jar. Every Depression-era kitchen had one. A coffee tin or a glass mason jar sat right next to the stove full of strained, golden brown bacon fat. Your great-grandmother would cook breakfast, then carefully pour the hot grease through a square of cheesecloth or an old flour sack rag, catching every drop in that jar. That was the cooking fat for the entire week. She fried potatoes in it. She made gravy with it. She greased her cornbread skillet with it. She even spread it on bread when butter was a fantasy, dusted it with salt, and called it a sandwich. A pound of bacon cost about 38 cents in 1933, and that single pound produced enough rendered fat to last 10 days of cooking. Modern food writers act horrified by this, but food chemists at the University of Wisconsin tested rendered bacon fat in 2018 and found it remarkably stable, lower in trans fats than most commercial vegetable oils, and rich in oleic acid. Your great-grandmother was throwing nothing away because she could not afford to. She just happened to be making her food taste better in the process. Number 24. Mock apple pie made from Ritz crackers. This sounds like a joke. It is not. When apples cost too much in the winter of 1934, and you still wanted pie for Sunday dinner, people reached for a sleeve of Ritz crackers. Ritz had launched that same year for 19 cents a box, and the recipe was printed on the back of the box for decades. The recipe called for 20 crushed Ritz crackers, 2 cups of water, 2 cups of sugar, 2 teaspoons of cream of tartar, lemon juice, and cinnamon. The cream of tartar provided the tart bite of an apple. The crackers absorbed the syrup and broke down into something that genuinely resembled cooked apple slices in both texture and appearance. Baked between 2 pie crusts, the result fooled people. It still fools people. Blind taste tests run by food writers in the 1990s found that most testers could not tell the difference. The trick was the cream of tartar reacting with the sugar to create that specific apple pie tang that nothing else replicates. A whole pie cost about 11 cents to make in 1934. A real apple pie cost 3 times that. Number 23. Water pie. Here is a Depression dessert that sounds like it cannot possibly work. Pour 1 1/2 cups of water into an unbaked pie shell. Sprinkle in 4 tablespoons of flour mixed with 3/4 of a cup of sugar. Add a teaspoon of vanilla. Dot the top with 5 tablespoons of butter cut into small pieces. Bake at 400 F for the first 30 minutes, then 375 F until set. What comes out is a pie with a sweet custard filling that tastes like vanilla pudding and creme brulee had a child. The flour thickens the water as it bakes. The butter melts down through the filling, and the sugar caramelizes lightly on top. Nobody knows for certain who invented water pie, but recipes for it appear in handwritten community cookbooks across Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia from 1931 onward. It cost about 6 cents to make a whole pie when the pantry was bare and the children needed something sweet at the end of supper. Water pie was the answer. Most Americans today have never even heard of it. Number 22. Coffee stretched with cory root. A pound of coffee costs 26 cents in 1932, which sounds cheap until you realize that 26 cents was almost half a day's wages for a working man during the depths of the Depression. So housewives stretched their coffee. The trick came up from New Orleans, where Creole cooks doing it for a century. You roasted curry root, which grew wild in roadside ditches and cost nothing until it was dark and brittle. Then you ground it and mixed it half and half with real coffee grounds. The result was a brew that tasted darker, deeper, and almost more coffee-like than coffee itself. The curry added body without bitterness, and 1 can of Fuller's could be stretched into 2 weeks of mornings. Café Demand in New Orleans still serves this exact blend today, and tourists pay premium prices for it. Your great-grandmother was paying nothing because she dug the curry herself. Number 21. Eggshells to clarify coffee. Even after the curry trick, Depression-era coffee was rough. The grounds were cheap, the brewing was inconsistent, and the result often came out cloudy with sediment floating across the surface. Your great-grandmother fixed this with 1 crushed eggshell dropped right into the percolator. The calcium carbonate in the shell pulled the bitter tannins and the loose grounds toward the bottom of the pot, leaving the coffee on top clear, smooth, and noticeably less acidic. This trick appears in cookbooks going back to the 1880s, but it became universal during the Depression because every kitchen had eggshells and nobody could afford to throw out coffee that turned out wrong. A clean shell from breakfast, washed, crushed, dropped in the pot. The result rivaled what hotels served. Nobody does this anymore because we have paper filters. But the eggshell trick worked on a chemical level that filters do not actually changing the taste of the coffee, not just removing particles. Number 20. Sour milk into buttermilk. Refrigeration in 1933 meant a wooden icebox with a block of ice the size of a brick that had to be replaced every 3 days. When the ice melted faster than expected, the milk soured. Modern Americans throw soured milk down the drain. Your great-grandmother turned it into the most prized baking ingredient in her kitchen. Sour milk was buttermilk by another name. The lactic acid in spoiled milk reacted with baking soda to create the lift that made Depression-era biscuits the lightest, fluffiest things on the table. Pancakes made with sour milk were tender and tangy in a way that fresh milk could never match. A quart of milk cost 10 cents in 1933, and not a drop went to waste. The minute it started to clabber at the edges, it went into a separate jar marked sour and sat there waiting for biscuit morning. Modern recipes call for buttermilk specifically because nothing else works the same way. Your great-grandmother had buttermilk for free 3 or 4 times a week just by paying attention to her milk. First pattern break. Here is where Depression cooking gets interesting. Most of these hacks were not invented during the Depression. They were inherited. They came from immigrant grandmothers who had learned them in the old country during famines and wars going back centuries. The Depression did not teach Americans how to be poor. It reminded them the Italian woman in Brooklyn who stretched her tomato sauce with breadcrumbs had learned that from her mother in Naples in 1898. The German farm wife in Iowa who turned cabbage into sauerkraut had learned that from her grandmother in Bavaria in 1875, when the bottom fell out of the American economy in October of 1929. Those memories woke up. The skills had been hibernating. They came roaring back in time to feed a generation. And then, we forgot them again the moment we got. We forgot them again the moment we got rich. That forgetting was the real loss. Number 19. Hoover Stew. Named ironically after President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for the Depression. This was the meal of the Hoovervilles, the shanty towns, where displaced families slept in tents and tar paper shacks. Hoover stew was whatever you had thrown into one pot. The classic version was hot dogs sliced into coins, canned tomatoes, macaroni, and any vegetables that were going soft in the bin. Onions, carrots, a wilted stalk of celery, a can of corn if you had it, a can of beans if the corn was already used. Everything simmered together for 30 minutes until the pasta cooked through and the broth thickened. A whole pot fed 6 people for under 30 cents. The hot dogs were the cheapest meat in America at the time, for cents apiece. The macaroni stretched everything. The tomatoes added the suggestion of a real Italian dish. Mothers served it with a slice of buttered bread, and children ate without asking questions. There are old photographs from 1934 showing entire neighborhoods sitting on porches eating Hoover stew on summer evenings. It looked like dinner. It tasted like getting through. Number 18. Onion sandwiches. This one will turn modern stomachs, but in 1933, an onion sandwich was a real lunch for millions of working Americans. It was a thick slice of raw white onion between two slices of buttered white bread. Sometimes a sprinkle of salt, sometimes a smear of mustard. That was it. James Beard, the famous American chef, wrote about onion sandwiches with genuine reverence later in his career, calling them the most underrated lunch in American cuisine. The sweetness of a good Vidalia or Spanish onion against the richness of butter and the soft texture of fresh white bread created something far more interesting than the ingredients suggested. A pound of onions cost 3 cents in 1932. A loaf of bread was 8 cents. This was lunch for a week if you stretched it. Workers carried these sandwiches into the fields and the factories. The smell on their breath afterward was less important than the fact that they had eaten at all. Number 17. The poor man's meal. This was a Depression-era classic that fed children across the Midwest. One sliced potato, one sliced onion, to hot dogs cut into chunks, all fried together in a cast-iron skillet with a spoonful of bacon grease, salt, and pepper. That was the entire recipe. The potato crisped at the edges. The onion turned sweet and translucent, and the hot dogs added smoky meatiness to everything. It cost about 14 cents to feed a family of 4 with this dish in 1934. Nothing fancy, nothing remarkable. Just hot food on a cold night when the paycheck was gone and the next one was 3 days away. Mothers served it on whatever plates they had left after pawning the good china to pay the gas bill. Children remembered it for the rest of their lives. Number 16. Stretching meat with oatmeal. When meatloaf became a cultural fixture during the Depression, it was not because Americans suddenly loved meatloaf. It was because mixing rolled oats into ground beef stretched 1 pound of meat into enough food for 6 people. The classic ratio was 1 cup of dry oats and 1/2 cup of milk per pound of beef. The oats absorbed the meat juices, and the milk swelling into something that mimicked the texture of meat itself. The result was a tender, moist loaf that sliced clean and tasted richer than plain ground beef. Nutritionists at the time, working with limited information, accidentally discovered that the combination of grain and meat created a more complete protein profile than either alone. Your great-grandmother knew nothing about amino acids. She just knew the family complained less about meatloaf than they did about bean soup. A pound of beef cost 22 cents in 1934. A box of oats cost 9. The math made the meal. Number 15. Burnt sugar for caramel coloring. Burnt sugar for gravy browning. When gravy looked too pale and the meat drippings were thin and grayish, your great-grandmother reached for white sugar. She would put 2 tablespoons of sugar into a small dry skillet and heat it slowly until it melted, then darkened, then almost smoked. That deep mahogany syrup, a few drops at a time, transformed wheat gravy into something that looked like it came from a Sunday roast at a fine restaurant. The trick was stopping just before the sugar burned bitter. The brown color and slight caramel flavor masked the fact that the meat itself had been a 12-cent piece of stew beef. Restaurants still use this technique today, calling it gravy browning, and they sell little bottles of it for $4. Your great-grandmother made it on the stove in 90 seconds for free. Number 14. Stretching butter with gelatin. Here is the hack the government did not want spreading during the war years. Butter was rationed heavily during World War II. But the technique came from the Depression. Your great-grandmother could double her butter by whipping it with an equal volume of unflavored gelatin dissolved in warm milk, then chilling the mixture until it was solid. The result spread like butter, melted like butter on hot toast, and tasted almost identical to the real thing. 1 pound of butter became 2 pounds of spread for the cost of a 5-cent packet of Knox gelatin. Government nutritionists during rationing actively discouraged this practice because it allowed families to use less of their butter ration and to stockpile, which threw off the careful supply chain management of the War Food Administration. They wanted butter consumption to match the ration tables. The hack worked too well. By 1944, the government was running radio ads suggesting that stretched butter was inferior nutritionally, which was not actually true. Your great-grandmother made her butter ration last through the entire war. The government wished she had not figured out how. Number 13. Reusing pickle brine. A jar of pickles cost about 15 cents in 1933, and when the pickles were gone, the brine in the jar was still loaded with vinegar, salt, sugar, and dill. Your great-grandmother would slice cucumbers, onions, or carrots from the garden, drop them into that jar, and put it back in the icebox. 3 days later, free pickles. The brine could be reused 2 or 3 times before it lost its bite. Some families kept a permanent pickle jar going for months, refreshing it with new vegetables and a splash of fresh vinegar every few weeks. This practice has come back into fashion among gourmet cooks who call it quick pickling and pay premium prices for fancy pickling spices. Your great-grandmother was just refusing to pour anything down the drain that still had work left in it. Number 12. Bread heels into breadcrumbs. Nothing in a Depression kitchen got thrown away, and the rock-hard ends of stale bread loaves were no exception. Your great-grandmother dried them out completely on top of the warm stove or in a low oven, then crumbled them in a paper bag with a rolling pin. Those breadcrumbs went into meatloaf, into stuffing, into the breading for whatever cheap fish the family ate on Friday. They thickened soups when flour was running low. They topped casseroles to give the suggestion of crust. A loaf of bread that would have cost 8 cents was used down to the last molecule. Modern Americans throw out the equivalent of 40 pounds of bread per person per year. Your great-grandmother threw out none. Second pattern break. Here is the part that gets uncomfortable. The food industry watched what happened during the Depression and learned something important. Americans had figured out how to feed themselves on almost nothing. Once the economy recovered in the 1940s and 1950s, food companies spent enormous sums on advertising designed specifically to make these hacks feel old-fashioned, embarrassing, and unsanitary. Crisco ran ads showing modern housewives in clean kitchens with bright white shortening, contrasting them with grimy depictions of women using yellowed bacon grease. Fuller's launched campaigns suggesting that real coffee did not need